The park was Michael Harris's escape. After a grueling week overseeing construction projects downtown, this pocket of greenery in the middle of the city was where he came to decompress. At 32, Michael had learned to carve out moments of peace where he could, and today it was on a bench with his favorite book, The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. The words resonated deeply, a mirror to his own experiences navigating the unspoken rules of being a black man in America. Michael was tall, with broad shoulders and an easy confidence that belied years of hard work and quiet resilience. He had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, where history loomed heavy in the air. From the segregated stories his grandmother told him to the microaggressions he still faced daily, Michael had long understood that his very existence was political, yet he had refused to let it define him. Armed with a degree in civil engineering and a knack for problem-solving, he'd built a life in New York City, far from the streets of his youth but never far from the weight of his identity. Across the park, Rebecca Whitman watched him. She didn't know his name, nor did she care to. In her eyes, Michael wasn't a person. He was a symbol, a disruption to her sense of control. Rebecca, 45, was the kind of woman who made her presence felt wherever she went. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, her yoga pants and fitted jacket a curated blend of high-end activewear. She held the leash of her golden retriever, Barkley, like a badge of authority. Rebecca had grown up in a suburban bubble outside St. Louis, a place where everyone looked and thought like her. She had inherited her parents' values without question, absorbing the unspoken rules about who belonged where. When she moved to the city years ago, she thought of herself as open-minded. She donated to causes, occasionally attended diversity panels at her workplace, and even smiled at the black security guard in her building. But deep down, she resented how the city was changing. It wasn't her city anymore, not with new faces, languages, and cultures encroaching on spaces she'd once felt were hers alone. Her gaze lingered on Michael as he read. He looked too comfortable, too at ease. A gnawing irritation bubbled in her chest, and she wasn't sure why. She just knew she wanted to put him in his place. "Hey!" she snapped, her voice cutting through the gentle hum of the park. Michael looked up, startled. He glanced around, unsure if the shout was directed at him, before meeting Rebecca's icy glare. "Yes," he replied, closing his book. Rebecca gestured sharply to the ground near his feet. "Your trash is right there. Aren't you going to pick it up?" Michael followed her gaze and spotted a crumpled napkin, clearly not his, lying on the ground by the bench. He frowned, a mix of confusion and disbelief crossing his face. "That's not mine," he said calmly, his southern lilt softening the edge in his voice. Rebecca scoffed, crossing her arms. "Of course it's not," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Michael felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. It was the kind of anger he'd been taught to swallow since he was a kid, the same anger he felt when a teacher accused him of cheating because his grades were too good, or when security guards trailed him at department stores. He took a steadying breath, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "If it bothers you that much," he said evenly, "you can pick it up yourself." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "People like you," she began, her voice low but laced with venom, "don't belong here. Why don't you just go back to Africa?" The words hung in the air like a slap. A few joggers slowed their pace, their curious gazes flickering between Michael and Rebecca. A young couple paused near a stroller, unsure whether to intervene. Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had heard it all before, maybe not in those exact words, but the sentiment was always the same. "Go back to Africa?" he repeated, his tone calm but firm. He stood slowly, his full 6'3" frame towering over Rebecca, his eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "Sure, but first let me teach you a little history lesson." Rebecca blinked, caught off guard by his composure. She opened her mouth to respond, but Michael cut her off, his voice growing louder for the benefit of the small crowd that had begun to gather. "You see, the only reason I'm here, why any of us are here, is because your ancestors dragged mine here in chains. My great-great-grandparents didn't come here looking for a better life. They were ripped from theirs to build this country for free. And now, you want to act like you own this place? Like you're entitled to decide who belongs and who doesn't?" Rebecca's face flushed red, though whether it was from anger or embarrassment was unclear. She tried to speak, but Michael wasn't finished. "You want me to go back to Africa?" he continued. "Maybe you should think about going back to Europe. Because unless you're Native American, this land isn't yours either. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. A woman sitting on a nearby blanket clapped slowly, and others joined in, their applause swelling in the quiet park. Rebecca's mouth worked soundlessly as she looked around, realizing that the crowd's attention was no longer on Michael, but on her. Michael picked up his book from the bench and slung his backpack over his shoulder. He turned back to Rebecca one last time, his voice quiet but cutting. Next time you try to tell someone where they don't belong, maybe start with yourself. He walked away without another glance, leaving Rebecca standing in the middle of the park, her dog sitting obediently at her feet. Around her, the whispers of judgment were impossible to ignore. Later that evening, Michael found himself back in his Brooklyn apartment, staring at the ceiling. The confrontation in the park played on a loop in his mind, each word from Rebecca echoing louder than the last. He wanted to believe he had handled it well, stood his ground, spoken his truth, but there was no denying the emotional toll. Encounters like that were never isolated. They were part of a pattern that chipped away at you, one incident at a time. Michael's apartment was modest, but thoughtfully arranged, with a small bookshelf crammed with titles by Baldwin, Morrison, and Coates. A framed photo of his mother sat on the windowsill, her kind smile and knowing eyes a source of comfort. She had raised him on her own, working double shifts as a nurse to ensure he never lacked for anything. "Don't ever let them break you," she used to tell him. "Your ancestors survived worse, so you can survive this." But surviving wasn't the same as living. Michael sighed and pulled out his laptop, opening the email he'd been drafting for weeks. It was addressed to a nonprofit organization that focused on urban redevelopment in underprivileged communities. He wanted to quit his corporate job and do something meaningful, something that would honor the sacrifices his mother and so many others had made. Yet every time he got close to hitting send, doubt crept in. What if he wasn't ready? What if it wasn't enough? Across the city, Rebecca sat in her pristine Upper West Side condo, sipping a glass of Chardonnay and scrolling through her phone. The evening news droned on in the background, its headlines a blur of political squabbles and crime reports. She'd spent the rest of the day stewing over the confrontation, replaying Michael's words in her head. "You don't belong here." She hadn't meant it like that, she told herself for the 100th time. It wasn't about race, it was about respect, about the way things used to be before people like Michael made everything about identity politics. But deep down, even Rebecca couldn't deny the truth. She had lashed out because he made her uncomfortable. He didn't fit into her picture of who should occupy the spaces she considered hers. Rebecca's childhood had been sheltered, her upbringing steeped in unspoken prejudices masked as traditional values. Her parents had never used slurs or overtly hateful language, but they didn't have to. Their disdain was in the way they locked their car doors in certain neighborhoods, or commented on the decline of their old suburb. Rebecca had absorbed these lessons without question, carrying them into adulthood and wrapping them in a veneer of civility. Her thoughts were interrupted by a text from her friend Lauren, who worked in marketing. "Lauren, saw what you posted earlier about the park. Be careful. You don't want to end up on someone's TikTok." Rebecca frowned. She hadn't posted anything directly about Michael, but she had written a vague rant about entitlement and people who don't respect public spaces. The post had garnered a handful of likes and supportive comments, but Lauren's message unsettled her. Was she overreacting? Meanwhile, Michael's phone buzzed with a notification. He checked it to find a link to a video someone had uploaded from the park earlier. The caption read, "Karen gets schooled in the park. Racism. Black excellence." He groaned. The clip showed Rebecca's outburst in full, followed by his measured response. It had already racked up thousands of views, and the comments ranged from praise for his composure to vitriol aimed at Rebecca. User 1. "This is what we need more of," calling out racists in real time. User 2. "She didn't even try to hide it. Disgusting." User 3. "My man handled it like a boss." But Michael couldn't bring himself to feel vindicated. Going viral wasn't the kind of change he was looking for. He didn't want to be a meme. He wanted systemic transformation. Back at Rebecca's apartment, her wine glass trembled as she clicked on the same video. Her face flushed as she read the comments, each one feeling like a slap. Karen was the word that stung the most. She had seen it used before to describe women who weaponized their privilege, but she had never imagined it would be used against her. The next morning, Their worlds collided again in a way neither could have anticipated. Michael was heading to a local coffee shop when he noticed a flyer taped to a lamppost. It advertised a community town hall meeting to discuss the future of the park. Intrigued, he snapped a photo of it. The park wasn't just a place for him to unwind. It was also a microcosm of the larger battle over public spaces in gentrifying neighborhoods like his. Rebecca saw the same flyer on her morning walk with Barkley. She hesitated for a moment before taking one. Her husband, a corporate lawyer who was often away on business, had been urging her to get more involved in community matters. This seemed like a chance to do just that, or perhaps to prove to herself that she wasn't what the internet thought she was. Neither of them knew that the meeting would force them to confront not only each other, but also the larger forces shaping their lives. The community center was packed. Rows of folding chairs faced a modest stage where a panel of local leaders and city officials sat under the sharp glare of fluorescent lights. The air buzzed with energy as neighbors debated everything from park maintenance to proposed development plans that threatened to reshape the area. Michael arrived early, settling into a seat near the back. He didn't expect to speak, but wanted to listen. The flyer had mentioned that a private development firm was eyeing part of the park for a luxury condo project, and as a civil engineer, Michael understood what that really meant. Higher rents, displaced residents, and the erasure of spaces meant for everyone. Rebecca entered with Barkley trotting obediently at her side. She scanned the room, immediately noticing the mix of attendees, residents who'd been in the area for decades, newcomers drawn by the neighborhood's rising status, and community organizers armed with notes and determination. Her gaze landed on Michael, seated alone with his notebook open. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, followed by something she couldn't quite name. "Rebecca," Lauren's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Her friend waved her over, already seated in a small cluster of similarly dressed professionals. Rebecca smiled tightly and joined them, though her attention kept drifting to Michael. The meeting began with a presentation from the developers. Polished in suits and armed with PowerPoint slides, they spoke of modernizing the community and creating opportunities for economic growth. The images of sleek glass-covered condos drew polite applause from some attendees and visible discomfort from others. When the floor opened for public comments, the tension that had been simmering all night erupted. "Who exactly are these opportunities for?" demanded an older black woman in the front row. "Because I've lived here for 40 years, and I haven't seen anyone ask what we want." A man in a Patagonia vest countered, "It's about progress. Don't we all want better amenities? Property values are going up. It's good for everyone. It's not good if we can't afford to live here anymore." The argument rippled through the room. Michael watched quietly, his pen moving across his notebook. This was the conversation he'd been expecting. A clash between those who saw development as a chance to profit and those who saw it as a threat to their homes and history. Then Rebecca raised her hand. "I understand the concerns," she began, her voice crisp and measured, "but I think we need to focus on finding a balance. Projects like this bring new energy and resources to neighborhoods. Isn't that what we all want?" Murmurs of agreement came from her side of the room, but Michael couldn't hold back any longer. He stood, the quiet rustle of his movements drawing attention. "With all due respect," he said, addressing Rebecca directly, "what you're describing as balance often ends up tipping the scales against people who've lived here their whole lives. It's easy to call it progress when you're not the one paying the price." Rebecca bristled. The memory of their encounter in the park flared in her mind, coloring her response. "That's not fair," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "Everyone deserves a say in how the neighborhood evolves. It's not about displacing anyone. It's about making things better." Michael took a step forward, his presence commanding the room. "Better for who?" he asked pointedly. "Because when developers come in, the people who've built this community, the ones who gave it its culture, its heart, are always the first to go. You can dress it up however you want, but we've seen this story before." The room fell silent, all eyes shifting between them. Rebecca felt her cheeks burn. She wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially not in public. Her friends exchanged uneasy glances, but none came to her defense. Michael, sensing the tension, turned to the crowd. "I'm not saying we shouldn't invest in our neighborhoods," he continued, "but that investment has to benefit everyone, not just the people who can afford $1 million condo." Applause broke out from several corners of the room. Rebecca sank back into her seat, her mind racing. She wasn't sure if she was angry at Michael or herself. After the meeting, Michael lingered near the exit, chatting with a group of activists who had invited him to join their efforts. Rebecca, feeling strangely compelled, approached him. "You made some good points in there," she said, her voice cautious. Michael glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Thanks." An awkward silence stretched between them. Rebecca hesitated, then added, "I didn't mean to come off harsh the other day in the park." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Harsh? That's an interesting word for what you said." Rebecca winced. "Look, I know it sounded bad." "It was bad," Michael interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "But if you're serious about learning, then start by listening." Rebecca nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. For the first time, she felt the cracks in her carefully constructed worldview, the weight of her assumptions pressing down on her. As she walked away, Michael watched her go, wondering if her words were genuine or just another attempt to save face. Either way, he didn't have time to dwell on it. The fight to protect the park and the community was just beginning. The days following the town hall were a blur of activity for Michael. The group of activists he had met, composed of longtime residents, community organizers, and young professionals, had invited him to join their planning committee. Their goal was clear: stop the developers and preserve the park as a shared space for everyone. Michael, with his background in civil engineering, quickly became a key figure in their efforts. His knowledge of zoning laws and infrastructure gave their arguments credibility, and his calm demeanor made him a natural leader. But the fight was far from easy. The developers had deep pockets, city connections, and a PR campaign that painted the project as a win for everyone. One evening, the group gathered in a cramped community center for a strategy meeting. The walls were covered in posters of past protests, and the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee. Michael stood at the front of the room, pointing to a map of the park projected onto the wall. "This section here," he said, gesturing with a laser pointer, "is where they want to start construction. If we can prove the project violates environmental codes or displaces too many residents, we might have a chance to delay it. But we need more voices at the next hearing." A hand shot up from the back of the room. It belonged to Sarah, a fiery college student with bright green hair and a knack for mobilizing people online. "What about the petition? We've already got over 2,000 signatures." Michael nodded. "That's a great start, but we need more than signatures. We need stories. Personal testimonies from people who will be directly affected by this project. That's what's going to sway public opinion." As the group buzzed with ideas, Michael's phone vibrated on the table beside him. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was an unknown number. Stepping out into the hallway, he answered the call. "Hello? Michael Harris?" came a familiar voice. His grip on the phone tightened. "Rebecca, I hope this isn't a bad time," she said hesitantly. "I got your number from the sign-in sheet at the town hall. I wanted to talk." Michael sighed. He wasn't sure he had the energy for whatever this was. "What do you need?" "I've been thinking about what you said," Rebecca admitted. "About listening, and you're right. I've never really thought about what all this means for people who've lived here longer than I have. I want to understand." Michael hesitated. He had heard similar sentiments before, often from people who wanted to ease their guilt rather than enact real change. But something in Rebecca's voice sounded genuine. "All right," he said finally. "Meet me at the park tomorrow at 10. I'll show you what you're not seeing." The next morning, Rebecca arrived at the park feeling uneasy. She wasn't sure why she had reached out to Michael, only that she couldn't shake the memory of his words at the town hall, or the way the crowd had rallied behind him. Michael was waiting near the playground, where children laughed and swung from monkey bars. He greeted her with a nod, his expression guarded. "Come on," he said, gesturing for her to follow. He led her through the park, pointing out details she had never noticed before. The worn-down basketball court where teens played every afternoon, the community garden tended by elderly residents, the makeshift memorial for a young man who had been killed in a nearby shooting. "This isn't just a park," Michael said. "It's a lifeline. For a lot of people, this is one of the only places they feel safe, where they can breathe. And if the developers get their way, it'll be gone, replaced by something they can't afford to step foot in." Rebecca frowned. "But can't there be a compromise? Keep part of the park and build around it?" Michael shook his head. That's how it starts. They promise to leave some green space, but it's never enough. And before you know it, the people who need this place the most are pushed out entirely. As they walked, Rebecca began to see the park through new eyes. She noticed the diversity of people, families, elders, kids, each with their own stake in this space. She also began to see herself more clearly, the privilege that had allowed her to overlook the struggles of those around her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. Michael stopped and looked at her, his gaze steady. "Because someone has to. Because I've seen what happens when no one speaks up, and because I owe it to my community, to my mother, my ancestors, to fight for something better." Rebecca nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She thought about her own life, her carefully curated comfort, and the bubble she had lived in for so long. For the first time, she felt an urge to step outside of it. That evening, Rebecca sat at her laptop, typing furiously. She wasn't sure if Michael would believe her, but she had decided to use her skills to help. As a marketing consultant, she knew how to craft a message, and she intended to use that expertise to support the group's campaign. When Michael saw the email from Rebecca later that night, he was surprised. She had attached a draft of a press release, complete with talking points, quotes, and strategies for reaching a wider audience. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," the email read, "but I want to help. Let me know if this is a start." Michael stared at the screen for a long time. Maybe Rebecca really was listening. 2 weeks later, the community was buzzing with activity. Michael's group had managed to secure a slot on the agenda for a city council meeting, where the fate of the park would be decided. With Rebecca's unexpected contributions, their campaign had gained traction, polished press releases, a social media presence that had gone viral, and local news outlets picking up their story. Michael was reluctant to admit it, but Rebecca's marketing expertise had become an invaluable asset. The two had developed a tentative working relationship. While Rebecca still struggled to shed the blind spots ingrained by years of privilege, Michael could see she was trying, showing up to meetings, talking to residents, and genuinely listening to their stories. But for all their progress, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting a losing battle. On the night of the city council meeting, the room was packed with supporters, developers, and curious onlookers. Michael and Rebecca sat together near the front, a stack of printed petitions and testimony statements between them. As the council members filed in, the tension in the room was palpable. The developers were first to speak, presenting glossy renderings of the proposed condos and touting the economic benefits of their project. Their spokesperson, a charismatic man in his 50s, gestured to a slide that read, "A brighter future for all. This development will bring jobs, modern amenities, and increased property values to the neighborhood," he declared, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity. "It's an opportunity to move this community forward." Murmurs of approval rippled through one side of the room, but Michael's group remained silent, their frustration visible. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he walked to the podium with quiet determination. He began by sharing stories from residents who relied on the park, the single mother who brought her kids there after school because she couldn't afford daycare, the retired veteran who found solace in tending the community garden, the teens who saw the basketball court as their sanctuary from the streets. "This isn't just about trees and grass," Michael said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "This is about people. Real people who will lose their home away from home if this project moves forward. You say it's about progress, but progress for who? Because it sure doesn't look like it's for the people who built this neighborhood." Applause erupted from his side of the room, while the developers exchanged uneasy glances. Rebecca felt a swell of pride as she watched Michael command the room. But then, a council member leaned into their microphone. "Thank you for your statement, Mr. Harris. But there's a question I'd like to ask the developers before we proceed." The spokesperson from the development company stepped forward, his confident smile never faltering. "Is it true," the council member asked, "that your firm has already purchased several properties surrounding the park, and that you've issued eviction notices to long-term residents?" A murmur of shock spread through the room. Michael's head snapped toward the developers, his heart sinking. The spokesperson's smile faltered for the first time. "We've made some acquisitions, yes," he admitted, carefully choosing his words. "But all legal procedures have been followed, and our plans include affordable housing units." "Affordable for who?" someone shouted from the back of the room. Michael's group erupted in outrage. Rebecca's jaw clenched as she exchanged a look with Michael. They had known the developers would play dirty, but evicting residents before the project was even approved felt like a low blow. The councilwoman raised her hand to restore order. "We'll hear more during deliberations," she said firmly, "but this raises serious concerns." After the meeting, Michael's group gathered outside the city hall steps, their frustration boiling over. "This is bigger than the park," Sarah said, pacing. "They're already clearing people out. Even if we stop them here, they'll just find another way." Michael leaned against a railing, his mind racing. He knew she was right. The fight for the park was just one battle in a much larger war. Rebecca approached cautiously, holding her phone. "Michael," she said, her voice urgent, "you need to see this." She handed him the phone and his stomach dropped as he read the headline. "Activist group leaders past ties to developers raise questions." The article alleged that Michael had once worked for a construction firm that partnered with the same development company they were fighting. It painted him as a hypocrite, suggesting he was using the campaign to settle old scores. "This is a hit piece," Rebecca said angrily. "They're trying to discredit you." Michael rubbed his temples, frustration mounting. "It doesn't matter if it's true or not. If people believe this, it could ruin everything." Rebecca grabbed his arm, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You've been honest with us from the start. That's all that matters. We'll fight this, just like we fought everything else." But Michael wasn't so sure. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. What if they couldn't win? The turning point came 2 days later, when a local news station aired a live interview with one of the residents who had received an eviction notice. The woman, an elderly widow named Mrs. Alvarez, spoke tearfully about the home she had lived in for 50 years and the fear of being forced out. "This isn't progress," she said, her voice breaking. "This is erasure." The video went viral, reigniting public outrage. Donations to Michael's group poured in, and city officials faced mounting pressure to take a stand. But the developers responded with an announcement that shocked everyone. They had no intention of backing down. "We believe in the future of this neighborhood," their spokesperson said at a press conference, "and we're committed to making it a reality." It was a declaration of war, and Michael knew they had no choice but to push harder than ever before. The days following the developers' press conference were a whirlwind. Michael's group was more determined than ever, but the stakes had skyrocketed. News outlets began framing the conflict as a battle for the soul of the neighborhood, pitting grassroots organizers against a billion-dollar corporation. Donations continued to flood in, but so did the threats. Michael's inbox was full of hateful messages. Some accused him of being a troublemaker, while others veered into overtly racist vitriol. He deleted most of them, but one stuck with him. "You're going to regret this." For Michael, the fight had become personal. It wasn't just about the park anymore. It was about proving to himself and to his community that they could stand up to the forces trying to erase them. But the pressure was taking a toll. He was barely sleeping, constantly juggling media interviews, strategy meetings, and his full-time job. At the same time, Rebecca found herself in unfamiliar territory. She was no stranger to managing crises, but this was different. For the first time, she wasn't just crafting a message for someone else. She was living it. Her name had started to appear in articles about the movement, and while some praised her for crossing lines of privilege, others criticized her for jumping on the bandwagon. "You don't owe them anything," her husband David said one night over dinner. Rebecca frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" David shrugged, sipping his wine. "You've already done more than most people in your position would. Why not step back and let them handle it?" Rebecca bristled. "You think this isn't my fight? Is it?" David asked, raising an eyebrow. "You've lived here for what, 6 years? You don't even go to that park unless it's with Barkley." His words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that this fight mattered in a way nothing else in her life ever had. At the next strategy meeting, the group gathered around a table covered in maps, laptops, and coffee cups. The atmosphere was tense. They had just learned that the developers were planning to break ground within the next 30 days, despite the city council's ongoing deliberations. "We can't let this happen," Sarah said, slamming her notebook shut. "If they start construction, it's over." Michael leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched into his face. "We need a bigger move, something that forces them to stop, Protests aren't going to be enough this time. Rebecca, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. What about an injunction? The room turned to her. If we can prove they're violating environmental regulations or city ordinances, we can get a court to issue a temporary stop work order, she explained. It won't be easy, but it could buy us time. Michael nodded slowly. Do we have the resources for that? We'd need a good lawyer, Rebecca admitted, but I can cover the initial fees if it comes to that. Her offer was met with surprised glances. Michael hesitated, torn between gratitude and suspicion. That's a big commitment. Rebecca met his gaze. I'm in this, Michael. For real. The next week was a blur of legal filings, community rallies, and escalating tensions. Rebecca used her connections to secure a meeting with a pro bono attorney specializing in environmental law, while Michael coordinated with local residents to gather evidence of the developers' shady practices. But as the movement grew, so did the opposition. One evening, as Michael was locking up the community center after a late meeting, he noticed a black SUV idling across the street. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He had seen that same car parked near his apartment the day before. He walked quickly to his car, his eyes scanning the darkened street. As he drove off, the SUV pulled out behind him, keeping a steady distance. Michael's chest tightened. Was he being paranoid? Or was someone trying to intimidate him? Rebecca faced her own challenges. At work, her colleagues began treating her differently. Some were supportive, but others made thinly veiled comments about her involvement. Didn't know you were into that whole social justice thing, one coworker said with a smirk during a meeting. Rebecca forced a smile, but inside, she felt the weight of their judgment. For years, she had played by the rules, staying within the comfortable confines of her privilege. Now, stepping outside that box felt like walking a tightrope. Her husband's disapproval didn't help. This isn't your problem, David said one night as they argued in the kitchen. Why are you putting yourself in the middle of this? Do you even know these people? I'm trying to know them, Rebecca shot back. That's the whole point. David shook his head, exasperated. You're risking your reputation, your career. For what? A park? It's not just a park, Rebecca snapped, slamming her hand on the counter. It's about what's right. Why is that so hard for you to understand? For the first time, Rebecca saw her husband for who he really was. Someone more concerned with maintaining the status quo than challenging it. As the court date for the injunction approached, tensions reached a boiling point. The developers launched a smear campaign targeting Michael and the group with ads claiming they were anti-progress and holding the community back. The ads ran on local TV stations and social media, fueling division among residents. At the same time, the group received an anonymous tip about the developers' plans to cut down several large trees in the park, trees that were home to a protected species of birds. The tip provided a critical piece of evidence for their case, but it also raised questions. Who had sent it, and why? Michael and Rebecca met at the park late one evening to review the new information. As they walked along the familiar paths, the weight of the fight pressed heavily on them. You ever feel like this is too big? Michael asked quietly. Rebecca glanced at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. All the time, she admitted. But then I think about what happens if we don't try. Michael nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You're full of surprises, Rebecca. She laughed softly. You're not so bad yourself, Harris. The moment of levity was brief but grounding, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, there was still hope. The court hearing for the injunction was set for Friday morning, but by Thursday night, it felt like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Michael's group had filed their evidence, including the anonymous tip about the protected bird species, but the developers had responded aggressively, hiring a high-powered legal team and flooding local media with advertisements about the positive impact of their project. That evening, the group gathered at the community center for one last strategy meeting. The energy in the room was a mix of nervousness and determination. We've got solid evidence, said Eleanor, the pro bono attorney Rebecca had found. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 40s who spoke with the confidence of someone who had faced bigger opponents before. If the judge rules in our favor, they won't be able to break ground until a full environmental review is completed. That could take months, maybe years. But if we lose? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with worry. Eleanor hesitated, then said bluntly, If we lose, they'll start construction on Monday. We're out of options after this. The weight of her words settled over the room. Michael stood up, his hands resting on the table in front of him. No matter what happens tomorrow, we've already accomplished something huge. We've brought people together, shown the city that we won't just roll over. That's a win in itself. The room erupted in quiet murmurs of agreement, but the tension remained. For many, this fight wasn't just symbolic. It was about survival. Rebecca sat in the corner, typing furiously on her laptop. Over the past few weeks, she had become the group's unofficial communications lead, crafting press statements and organizing online support. She had even convinced several local businesses to publicly back their cause. But as the meeting wrapped up, she noticed Michael lingering near the door, his expression distant. "You okay?" she asked, approaching him. Michael nodded but didn't look at her. "Just thinking about my mom," he said quietly. "She used to take me to a park like this when I was a kid. It was the only place where we could just be. No expectations, no judgments. I keep thinking about how much that meant to her. And to me." Rebecca hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. "You're doing right by her, Michael. You're doing right by all of us." He finally met her gaze, his eyes softening. "Thanks, Rebecca. I mean that." The morning of the hearing dawned gray and overcast, as if the weather itself understood the gravity of the day. Michael arrived at the courthouse early, dressed in a crisp suit and carrying a folder full of notes. Outside, dozens of supporters had gathered, holding signs that read, "Save our park and protect our community." Rebecca arrived soon after, carrying a stack of media packets. She had spent the night contacting reporters, ensuring the hearing would get maximum coverage. "Ready?" she asked Michael as they stood on the courthouse steps. "As I'll ever be," he replied, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. Inside, the courtroom was packed. On one side sat Michael's group, a diverse mix of residents, activists, and allies. On the other sat the developers, their team of lawyers dressed in sleek suits that exuded money and power. The hearing began with Eleanor presenting their case. She laid out the evidence meticulously, emphasizing the environmental impact of the proposed project and the community's reliance on the park as a vital resource. When she brought up the protected bird species, a ripple of interest passed through the courtroom. But the developers' lawyers were quick to counter. They dismissed the environmental concerns as exaggerated and painted the group as well-meaning but misinformed. As the arguments unfolded, Michael couldn't help but feel the balance of power in the room. The developers' lawyers were smooth and polished, their every word calculated, but Eleanor fought back with precision and passion, refusing to be intimidated. During a recess, Rebecca found Michael pacing in the hallway. "They're good," he admitted. "I hate to say it, but they're good." Rebecca handed him a bottle of water. "So are we, and we've got the truth on our side." Michael smirked. "That's one hell of a campaign slogan." The judge returned after a brief deliberation, her expression unreadable. As she began to speak, the courtroom fell silent. "After reviewing the evidence presented by both sides," she said, "I find sufficient cause to grant a temporary injunction against the proposed development project. No construction may begin until a full environmental review is completed." Cheers erupted from Michael's side of the room, while the developers' lawyers exchanged tense whispers. Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him as he turned to Rebecca, who was grinning from ear to ear. "We did it," she whispered. Outside the courthouse, the mood was celebratory. Supporters hugged, laughed, and took photos with their signs. Michael addressed the crowd, his voice full of gratitude and determination. "This isn't the end of the fight," he said. "But today, we proved what's possible when we come together. This park and this community are worth fighting for." Rebecca stood in the background, watching as Michael's words inspired the crowd. For the first time in years, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. But even as the group celebrated, Michael knew the developers wouldn't give up easily. This was a victory, but the war was far from over. Later that night, Michael sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through the countless messages of support flooding his inbox. One email caught his eye. It was from an anonymous sender. "Congratulations on the win, but be careful. They don't play fair." Michael's chest tightened. He stared at the screen, the shadow of unease creeping back in. The injunction had bought them time, but it wasn't long before the developers struck back. Within a week of the court ruling, Construction equipment appeared just outside the park's boundaries, a brazen display of defiance. Michael's group scrambled to confirm whether the developers were violating the injunction, but their legal team assured them that no construction had technically begun. "They're testing us," Eleanor explained during an emergency meeting. "They're trying to intimidate us into backing down." The developers weren't just testing boundaries, they were escalating. Flyers began appearing around the neighborhood, falsely accusing the activist group of blocking progress and costing the city jobs. A local business owner who had supported the campaign reported vandalism at her storefront, and several group members received anonymous threats. One evening, as Michael walked home from a meeting, he noticed the black SUV again. It was parked at the corner of his street, its headlights off, but the faint glow of a phone screen visible inside. Michael's pulse quickened as he turned down a side alley, taking a longer route to his building. When he finally reached his apartment, his phone buzzed with a new text message. "You're in over your head. Back off while you can." Michael stared at the screen, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He knew the developers were powerful, but this was something else, something personal. The next day, Rebecca arrived at the community center to find Michael sitting alone, his head in his hands. "You look like hell," she said, dropping her bag onto the table. Michael glanced up, his expression weary. "Thanks for the pep talk." She sat down across from him, her tone softening. "What's going on?" Michael hesitated, then showed her the text message. "It's not the first one," he admitted. "And I've been seeing that SUV everywhere I go." Rebecca's face darkened. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want to freak everyone out," he said. "This fight is bigger than me, Rebecca. If I start acting scared, it'll shake the whole group." Rebecca leaned forward, her voice firm. "You're not in this alone, Michael. If they're trying to intimidate you, it's because they know we're winning. But we can't let them break us." Michael nodded, her words grounding him. "You're right, I need to figure out our next move." That next move came sooner than expected. Late that night, Michael received a frantic call from Sarah. "They're in the park," she shouted. "They're cutting down the trees." Michael jumped out of bed, pulling on his jacket as he ran out the door. By the time he arrived at the park, a small crowd of residents and activists had gathered at the edge of the construction zone. Floodlights illuminated a row of bulldozers and chainsaws, their operators working quickly to clear trees despite the injunction. Rebecca was already there, her phone raised as she live-streamed the scene. "We need more people down here," she said, her voice urgent. "If you're in the area, come to the park now." Michael pushed through the crowd, his anger boiling over. "Hey!" he shouted, stepping into the floodlights. "This is illegal. You're violating a court order." One of the workers glanced at him but didn't stop. Behind them, a man in a suit. The developer's site manager smirked. "We're clearing debris," the man said smoothly. "Perfectly within our rights." "That's not debris," Michael snapped, pointing at a century-old oak tree. "That's a protected landmark." The site manager shrugged. "Prove it." The tension in the air was electric as more residents arrived, their shouts growing louder. Someone had brought a megaphone, and chants of "Save our park" echoed through the night. Michael turned to Rebecca. "We need to stall them until the police or media get here." Rebecca nodded, her mind racing. "What about a sit-in?" Michael hesitated, then realized she was right. "Let's do it." He stepped into the path of the bulldozers, raising his hands. "Stop," he shouted. "If you want to tear this place down, you'll have to go through me." Rebecca joined him, followed by Sarah and several others. Within minutes, dozens of residents had formed a human barrier around the remaining trees, their determination outweighing their fear. The site manager's smirk faded as the crowd grew. He pulled out his phone, barking orders to someone on the other end. The police arrived shortly after, but by then, local reporters and social media influencers had flooded the scene. The live-streamed protest had gone viral, with thousands tuning in to watch the community stand its ground. As the police assessed the situation, Eleanor arrived with a printed copy of the injunction. "They're in direct violation of this order," she told the officers, her voice steely. "If you allow this to continue, you'll be complicit." The officers reluctantly ordered the workers to stop, but not before several trees had been destroyed. The crowd erupted in cheers as the bulldozers powered down, but the victory felt bittersweet. Michael stood in the center of the group, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. Rebecca placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," she said. "For now, Michael replied, his voice heavy. But they'll be back. The protest became a turning point in the movement. The footage of residents standing in front of bulldozers, risking their safety for the park, sparked outrage across the city. Donations poured in, and high-profile figures began voicing their support. Even the mayor, who had remained neutral until now, issued a statement condemning the developers' actions. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the fight had taken a darker turn. The threats against him intensified, and several group members reported strange cars parked near their homes. One night, as he sat alone in his apartment, his phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "You can't win, walk away while you still can." Michael stared at the message, his resolve hardening. "We're not walking away," he muttered. "Not now, not ever." A month after the protest, the movement had grown into something bigger than anyone could have imagined. The footage of residents forming a human barrier around the park had sparked not only local outrage, but also national attention. News outlets ran stories about the David and Goliath battle between the community and the developers, and hashtags like #SaveOurPark and Community Over Profit trended for days. The developers, under mounting pressure, launched a desperate counter-campaign. They promised to include affordable housing in their project, announced plans for a small public garden, and doubled down on their claims about job creation. But the damage to their reputation was done. Investors began pulling out, and city officials who had once supported the project now distanced themselves. For Michael and the group, the turning point came when the mayor's office announced an emergency review of the development's permits. The mayor, forced to take a stand after weeks of public scrutiny, declared the park a historical landmark and placed an indefinite freeze on all construction activity. The victory was hard won, and when the news broke, the celebration at the community center was electric. People hugged, laughed, and cried, their relief and joy palpable. Michael stood at the front of the room, watching the group he had come to see as family. Rebecca was there too, sitting with Sarah and Eleanor, a rare smile lighting up her face. As the crowd quieted, Michael cleared his throat and raised his hands. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, earning a round of laughter. "But I just want to say, thank you. This fight wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but we did it. Together, we showed them that this community matters, that our voices matter, and that we're not going anywhere." The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls. For Michael, the victory wasn't just about the park. It was about proving to himself, and to others, that change was possible. He decided to leave his corporate job and accepted a position with a nonprofit focused on urban renewal and affordable housing. It wasn't the most lucrative path, but it was the right one. Rebecca, too, found herself transformed by the experience. She and her husband eventually separated, a decision that felt more like liberation than loss. She poured her energy into advocating for equitable development, using her marketing skills to support grassroots movements like Michael's. One sunny afternoon, months after the court's final ruling, Michael and Rebecca met at the park. Children played on the swings, teens shot hoops on the newly refurbished basketball court, and a group of elders tended to the community garden. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Rebecca said, gesturing to the scene. Michael nodded, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. "It is, and it's theirs. That's what matters." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Rebecca spoke again. "Do you ever think about how this all started?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Michael chuckled. "You mean when you told me to go back to Africa?" Rebecca winced. "Okay, maybe not my finest moment." Michael looked at her, his expression softening. "But look where we are now. People can change, Rebecca. You proved that." She smiled, grateful for his words. "And you proved that one voice can make a difference." As they watched the park come alive with activity, the weight of their journey felt lighter. The fight hadn't been easy, and the scars of the struggle remained, but they had won, together. And for the first time in a long time, both Michael and Rebecca felt hopeful about the future. Years later, the park became a symbol of community resilience, a place where generations gathered to celebrate their shared history and envision a brighter future. Michael's nonprofit grew into a powerful force for change, influencing urban policy across the city. Rebecca started her own consultancy, helping other neighborhoods fight for equity and sustainability. The oak tree at the center of the park, the one they had fought so hard to save, stood tall and proud, its branches stretching toward the sky. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Dedicated to the people who fought to protect this space for everyone. Together, we thrive." Michael and Rebecca's story isn't just about saving a park. It's about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. Their fight reminds us that our voices matter, and that change begins when communities come together with a shared purpose. Across the world, similar battles are being fought. Neighborhoods are transformed by forces that often disregard the people who live there. From gentrification to environmental destruction, these struggles feel overwhelming. But this story shows that collective action, resilience, and allyship can make a difference. Now, we want to hear from you. What did this story inspire in you? Are there issues in your community that need attention? Have you witnessed change, big or small, that made a difference? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Here's how you can take action. Join the conversation. What resonated most with you? Was it Michael's determination, Rebecca's growth, or the community's resilience? Leave a comment and let's discuss. Be the change locally. Look at your own community. Are there spaces that need protecting or voices that need amplifying? Start by joining a local advocacy group, signing a petition, or simply starting a conversation. Share this story. Spread the message. Share Michael and Rebecca's journey on your social networks and inspire others to take action. Use the hashtags Save Our Community and Together We Thrive to keep the movement alive. Small steps create ripples. Together, those ripples can turn into waves of change. Your voice matters, whether through words, actions, or support for those leading the charge. Hit the like button, share your perspective, and let's inspire more people to stand up for what truly matters.